Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Nurturing Relationships, our 6-week journey exploring Jewish wisdom for building deeper, richer connection in all of our relationships. Lesson 3. The title of this afternoon's lesson is The Art of Disagreeing. And we are going to talk about disagreeing in a healthy way. In other words, we're hopefully not going to talk about creating some sort of reality where there's no disagreeing possible, but rather what's the proper way to disagree in relationships so that the relationship stays intact, but we still manage to be two separate entities. This afternoon's lesson is this afternoon and evening's lesson is generously sponsored by Jonathan Gelman, who's here. Thank you, Jonathan. And Phil and Sonia Worshba, who usually come in person in the evening. And this whole lesson, really you could start off by saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? And that's something I think that often we tend to just nod our heads in agreement. We're like, yeah, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, that's a normal thing. We disagree with each other, that's a good thing. But I think what we want to try and address today is that despite the fact that you can often have 2 Jews, 3 opinions, disagreements can present challenges for our relationships. So you guys remember in lesson 1 when we discussed that when we're talking about relationships, we're not just talking about spousal relationships, we're talking about all the different circles. Let me pull it up again here, right? So I want to try and consider some disagreements. I'm not going to go through all 4 circles, but let's at least try in number 1 and number 3. In the circle of intimacy and in the circle of participation, some examples of disagreements. If you take a look on page 95, you see they have some for you, right? Very commonly, in the circle of intimacy, you have spouses that disagree over spending habits, right? Or savings goals or things like that. You have spouses that disagree over the division of labor and household chores. I want to take care of this. You're not taking care of this properly. Let me take that over from you, etc. Or about their dieting and eating habits. You have to go on a diet. You care too much about your figure. You should not be dieting as much, etc. And then in the parental sphere, which is also part of the intimacy circle, right? They often disagree about disciplinary approaches or educational philosophies or screen time rules. Even when it comes to siblings, last week we spoke about one common example, right, which is, and we had it in the video last week, that often siblings disagree about how to care for their parents. The parents are aging, and this one says, oh, look, we have to put them in a home, and this one says, no, we have to make sure that they retain their independency, and you know, whatever stage of the game they're at, there's often disagreements in the circle of intimacy. And I guess that's what we'd like to try and address today. But it's important to understand that disagreements can happen in other circles as well. In your circle of participation, which you'll remember is, let's say, for example, the people that go to the same shul as you, or the people that sit on the HOA board with you. I think Jonathan last week was sharing with me some of the disagreements that there were on your HOA board. It could be things like how we should use the money from the HOA. It could be things like how the shul should run. I donate money to the shul, and now I want to be able to have a say in how the shul gets run. But obviously, everybody gives money to the shul, and everybody has opinions, and sometimes those opinions disagree with each other. Coworkers or partners, even, right? The partners in a business, it doesn't have to be coworkers that are under the same boss. They can disagree about how much risk they should be taking, or what the strategy for the business going forward is. Neighbors can disagree. Even if they're not on the same HOA, can disagree over social issues, the role of government, the economy. I'm sure none of you have any disagreements politically with anybody around you, right? I'm sure whatever your political opinion is, everybody else in on your block holds exactly the same way as you. So this is kind of the topics that we'd like to try and discuss today. So let's open up with an exercise. On page 96, you'll see we're asking a simple question. From the above lists, right, figure 3.1, select an item that parallels your personal experience and consider what that experience taught you, right? So I'm sure some of you have had some of the disagreements that there are in the figure on page 95. So on page 96, we're asking you, what are 3 essential do's and don'ts for maintaining harmony in a relationship that you might have learned from those disagreements? In other words, you might have been through a situation of disagreement and you've learned some do's and don'ts. Try to put some of them down on paper. If anyone wants to share, I'd love to hear a little bit about that. Because before we dive in and see what the Torah has to say about it, I'd love to hear what you have to say, what you've learned. I mean, we've both been, all of us on here have been disagreeing pretty much as we've been alive. You know what I mean? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, in regard to the spousal disagreements, I got married late in life, and I think just the life lesson that I've learned is not to sweat the small stuff.
Okay.
So, certainly there might be disagreements in certain aspects, but for example, the spouse wants to purchase or have purchased an expensive item, right?
Right.
Um, on the surface, it might seem outrageous, and or but you take a step back and you say to yourself, well, this particular item makes that person really happy, and in the grand scheme of things, does this take away anything from our livelihood? It doesn't.
Right.
So, you know,
So really,
what's the point of creating a stress for everyone and fighting
right.
about it if right
Right.
if it really is not in a grand scheme of things that big
So
of a
if I
deal.
may, I think you're really saying 2 points. Number one is don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah,
And number two, if you think it's big stuff, just a little bit of a broader perspective will make you realize that almost everything is small stuff. There's very, very few things that we actually care enough about. Yeah. Some people use that term, especially you get an example of spousal disagreement. Some people use the term, would I get divorced over that? Right? Almost always
right.
the answer is no, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
very few things that you'd be like, oh, the relationship was not. So if that's the case, then take it easy, take a step back, right?
yeah.
Okay. Phil, you want to share something?
Well, I was just going to say, as far as do's and don'ts in a relationship, I mean, it's kind of what we talked about last week was listening and not necessarily as, this is probably a general statement, but I think a lot of men, or at least me included, my tendency is to want to try to fix or solve a problem and provide a solution when sometimes all that I really need to do is just be an empathetic listener and be compassionate and understand that whatever my spouse is sharing, that it's important to them and there's a reason that they're sharing it. So the listening aspect of last week's lesson was very important to remember.
Right. Um, I like what you're saying. It's definitely 100% true. I'm trying to figure out whether it's going to be as applicable to today's lesson or if maybe you're still on last week's lesson. In other words, last week's lesson was all about listening, and listening obviously plays a huge role in disagreeing. You have to make sure that you're actually being an active listener. But even the most active listener, at a certain point, there comes a point where I listen to you, I heard your opinion, but I disagree. I have a completely different approach. We know that the world is made up of a kaleidoscope of different people, right? Even the most respectful people can have disagreements, and the question is often that has to do with the real world. Though, is how do you go forward with a disagreement?
Well, I think the other, okay, so as far as how it might apply to this week's lesson, I think something I've learned from my experience is to just communicate my experience and not to, and basically keep my side of the street clean and not, say, oh, I do this because you do that, or I'm sorry if I did such and such. Like, just take responsibility for my own actions.
I like that. So you're really saying two things. Number one is you're saying you try to disagree. It sounds like respectfully, like from your perspective. Even though there's always two people in an argument, right? There's two people in a disagreement, but it seems like you're saying you try to keep your side as respectful and as healthy as possible. And number two, you're saying is um, that you try to communicate very clearly your perspective without kind of forcing it on the other person. Okay, all right, we got a lot to work with here. Ron, you came just as we were doing the do's and don'ts. We're on page 96. Now, before we continue into today's lesson, I want to actually clarify one massive disclaimer, or really two massive disclaimers about what this lesson is not about. Okay, the reason this is so important is because disagreement really spans a massive kaleidoscope, right? Like, for example, Jonathan had specific. I think both of you tackled really spousal disagreements. One could argue that disagreement leads to divorce, but not. I guess let's take both sides of the spectrum. On the one hand, you could say disagreement leads to divorce, right? So that's all the way on one side of the spectrum, and then you can say all the way on the other side of the spectrum. But any relationship that doesn't have disagreement in it, you'd be like, that doesn't really sound like a real relationship to me. It sounds like it's waiting to explode, and it's going to explode soon, right? Like they're just dancing around each other or something like that. So I want to talk about two things. Number one, today's lesson, while it's about disagreement, it's not about betrayal. Okay? So let's say, for example, you have a relationship with a partner in the business world, right? So two partners own a business, a startup together. You started in your garage. It's grown to be a multi-million-dollar business. You guys have a business together. One type of disagreement is you're sitting in a boardroom meeting. You guys are doing very, very well, and you're trying to figure out, each of you has a completely different opinion about which direction to take the business. Maybe one of them wants to go public, and one of them is like, no, let's bring on more partners and let's figure out how to grow this in the private sector. Whatever it is, you know what I mean? And that can be a major, major disagreement, but that's not betrayal. A different conversation is if these two partners, if one of them finds out that the other one has maybe been siphoning off money without saying anything to the other. I mean, I guess that's theft. But even just betrayal, even just like he's been talking to all the other employees in the company and kind of collecting a support base because he's on the other side of the aisle, that starts to be betrayal. That's not just, and I'm sure we can all think of circles like that in parental relationships or in spousal relationships. That would be the same idea. We're not really talking like if a husband catches, if one spouse catches the other spouse being unfaithful in a marriage, that's not disagreement. That's betrayal, and it's got its whole own thing. And I'm not saying it's not reparable. In fact, in lesson 6, we're going to touch on it, although probably not going to do it enough justice. We'll probably talk much more about it in the Art of Marriage, which is a course that's coming up in March. But in lesson 6, when we talk about forgiveness, we are going to talk about, because here there's like more of a fundamental issue at play. What we want to try and address today is standard disagreements. So that's why the other thing I want to take out of the picture here is moral deficiencies. We're not talking about here where one person maybe has a major anger management issue and he goes to therapy for it, or has an addiction, a substance addiction issue, right? And then that leads to disagreement. Yes, there's disagreement there, and you can definitely call it disagreement, but the real issue on the table and the elephant in the room is how to deal with that particular moral deficiency, whatever it may be, that's causing this strife. Okay, so that's what I kind of want to take that off the table, and now I think we're ready to dive into today's lesson. Today's lesson is primarily going to be divided into 3 primary sections. I like to do this for you guys. I like to set what's going to happen today, then we'll dive into it. The first one is my favorite. It's going to be dispelling some common myths about disagreement in relationships. And I think that's going to give us a very basic framework, even just for defining disagreement. Like we've already started to now. We said it's not betrayal. It's not when there's moral deficiencies, but there's going to be more. There's a couple of myths that I want to kind of bust before we go forward that will help us lay the ground rules. Then, of course, we're going to examine the Torah's approach to what we're going to do is we're going to examine the Torah's telling of the history of creation, and from that, and also from the lives of two Talmudic rabbis, we're going to get a more advanced approach to handling disagreements. So kind of not just basic. In section 1, we'll give a basic way, and then we'll take it to a more advanced approach, and then finally we'll give an even more advanced approach, and we'll get to some concrete behaviors, as always, some practical tips and hacks for avoiding disagreement. Okay, everybody with me here? Let's dive into it. The first myth that I want to dispel is that disagreement is a normal and necessary part of a relationship. I think it's very common for people to think that disagreement within a relationship means that there's a problem in the relationship. There's an issue on the table. And I think the first thing we need to talk about is that that's not true. That's myth number 1 that I'd like to bust today. And it starts with text 1a. Ron, you want to get us started? We're on page 98 for those following along in the book.
Just as human faces are not identical, so their minds are not alike.
Thank you. This comes to us from the Medrash in Tanchuma, and this is brought down in the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that there is a blessing that is made when you see 600,000 people in one place. Okay? And what is that blessing? That blessing is Birchat Chacham HaRasim, blessed is he who knows the secrets. Why is that? That is because when you see 600,000 people, one of the things that you're struck by, right, when you see a mass of people, one of the things that you're struck by is that they all look different. It's not just that they're male, female, different shades of skin, different heights, and different widths. That's a nice politically correct way to put it, right? Widths. They're of different widths, different sizes and shapes and colors and hues, right? They're also, you start to recognize that every single face is made slightly different. Even the doppelgangers that everybody always says, I found my doppelganger, right? Even them, you can tell them apart. Twins can be still told apart. So says the Medrash, you think this is just in their faces? You think this is just in their outward appearance? No, even inside, their personalities are different, their emotions are different, the way that they interact with other people is different. So that's why we make a blessing. Blessed is he who knows the secrets of every single human soul. Because you start to realize that if every single one is different, Hashem knows all of their secrets. Okay. Why is this so important? This is so important because we tend to think, well, at least I shouldn't say we. The myth that we're trying to dispel here is that people often think that disagreement means there's a weakening in the bond. Maybe it's weatherable. Maybe you can weather it. Maybe you can overcome it. But it means there's a weakening in the bond. And when people have a unanimous approach, that means there's a healthy bond. If two people agree with each other all the time, that means they're healthy. And that's actually 100% a complete myth. Why? Because actually Hashem created us differently, with different perspectives. Medrash doesn't just tell us that people's minds are alike, it actually goes even further, right? And by the way, think about the fact we make a blessing over this. Why do we make a blessing? Because Hashem created us that way, right? It's telling us that this is hardwired into human nature. So while there may be times when individuals feel an uncanny unity of mind, for the married folks on here, think of your first year after you were married, right? You almost had no disagreements with your spouse, or the first few months, or the first few weeks, or the first few hours. Depends who you are, At the beginning of a relationship, often is like, oh, I can't believe we agree on so many different things, right? That might be beautiful, but usually that's because there's something else that's muting or hiding the differences that we have. And I think what we're trying to say here is that differences in a relationship are not only expected, but they're also welcomed. Why? Because disagreement means that you now have a relationship where you can actually be authentically yourself, and that's why you come to a disagreement. No two people are exactly alike. So maybe you agree on a lot of things, but eventually, if you live with each other long enough, right? Or you hang around each other long enough, or you work together with each other long enough, or you siblings, whatever, right? Whatever category we're talking about, eventually, each of you becomes comfortable enough that you can actually be your authentic self and begin to express your opinion to someone else, and therefore that brings about the disagreement. So it's actually not only a natural thing, but it's a welcome thing. Accordingly, when a disagreement surfaces, I think it should be abundantly clear to all of us based on this. That's why I wanted to get this myth out of the way first. It should be abundantly clear it's not a crisis. It's something that needs to be dealt with. We need to have the right tools about how to deal with it healthily, but it's not a crisis. Okay. Indeed, if you take a second look, you'll see that that's what this passage of the Medrash is teaching us as well. Ron, you were reading for us, right? Let's keep going. Text 1b, 998, page 98.
The Midrash teaches just as human faces are not identical, so their minds are not alike. Just as you tolerate others despite their looking different from you, so must you tolerate others who think differently from you.
So this is Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, or the Kutzker Rebbe, and I think it's brilliant. He often used to like to play with words. And look at the way he takes this Medrash, which was text 1a, and he just flips it around. Right? He says the literal reading of the Medrash is telling you the same way their faces are different, their personalities are different. He says maybe that's also the lesson for how to deal with it. He says just as their faces being different shouldn't be, he says, isn't. But I'm going to paraphrase that because there are people that allow other people's looks to make them not get along with them. Racism is definitely a thing, right? But I think that that's a very basic thing we can get out of the way. I think we all know that we shouldn't be judging someone else just because of the way they look, therefore I disagree with them, right? So just as that is so simple to understand, we all understand just because somebody looks different than me doesn't mean that I can't get along with them. He says, flip it around. Just like looking shouldn't be a reason for you not to get along. Their personality and their uniqueness that they bring to the table shouldn't be a reason that you can't get along with them. Okay, so but that concludes myth number one that I wanted to bust. Disagreement is not a reason for concern. It's not a crisis. It just has to be dealt with. It's natural and it's normal and it's expected, and it's actually a healthy sign of a good relationship maturing. Okay. Myth number 2 that I want to talk about can best be described by, I think it was a Roman poet, Virgil, who lived in the 1st century BCE, who first said it. He said, "Love conquers all." And this is again a myth that tends to be very popular in pop culture. Why? Because, okay, once you appreciate that disagreement is natural and normal, so you ask people, so how do you overcome disagreement? You say, well, if you're in love enough, then the disagreements all fade away, right? In other words, yes, it is a big deal. Disagreements are a thing and they're there, but if you have enough love, then you can learn to look past person's disagreements and they don't bother you at all, and then you don't get into disagreements with each other. As we're going to see, not only are we going to be challenged on saying that that's a myth, we're actually going to say that, we're actually going to say that love can sometimes be part of the problem. Okay, and I think that's a very, very big myth that we need to bust. Let me give you an example. Rabbi Akiva, we're on page 99 here. Rabbi Akiva was an illustrious Torah luminary who flourished during the 2nd century of Common Era, one of the most famous rabbis, and he was most famous for the following statement: V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Those are words in the Torah. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. That's the purple words. That means love your neighbor as yourself. And Rabbi Akiva said, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is the Torah's major principle. Okay. Yet the Talmud unveils a very disturbing fact about the thousands and thousands and thousands of students that Rabbi Akiva had, as we'll see in just a moment. Elise, if I can ask you to read for us text 2a, student discord. We're on page 99. Don't forget to unmute.
Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students. They did not behave towards each other with respect.
Okay. The Talmud is telling us that Rabbi Akiva's students, even though they lived by the precept of to love your fellow as yourself, so they were trying to overcome any disagreement with love. There was an abundance of love. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love, 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 love. Somehow they were missing a different ingredient. And therefore all that love was actually leading to greater discord. And it was a severe failure. And the Talmud has to tell us the story in order to remind us to avoid this type of error. The question is, why? Why was it so difficult for them to get along with each other? So I think if we take a look back at text 2a, we'll start to see the answer. It says they did not behave towards each other with respect. Respect is an entirely different ingredient that often we are missing in a relationship, which is we think that love conquers all, and we forget that love has to be coupled with respect. Phil, if I can ask you to read for us, please, text 2b. The Rebbe begins to explain that Rabbi Akiva's students were overflowing with a real love for each other, but that actually was the source of the problem. The love wasn't balanced with respect. Let's see.
Our sages note that each human mind varies from all others. This was also the case with the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. They all grasped their master's teachings according to their individual paths and understandings, each assuming that their own interpretation was the true meaning of Rabbi Akiva's words. When they realized that their colleagues understood their master's words differently in a manner that they regarded as incorrect, they became disinclined to treat the others with esteem, specifically because of the fundamental teaching of Rabbi Akiva: love your neighbor as yourself. This is the Torah's major principle. Without this mandate, they might not have cared so much if a colleague failed to grasp what they considered to be the true meaning of their master's Torah. However, since their teacher, Rabbi Akiva, taught them about the importance of fulfilling the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, each student endeavored to influence all those included in the definition of neighbor, especially their fellow students, so that they would similarly grasp their master's Torah in the true way. They could not respect a colleague who did not accept this true way, or at least not to the extent expected of Rabbi Akiva's students.
Thank you, Phil. I think this is a very, very important lesson, and that's why we tell this story over in the Talmud. It turns out, and this is myth number 2, which I want to very successfully bust, love does not conquer all. In fact, love is often part of the disagreement. What do I mean? You love someone so much, right, that therefore you say to them, I need you to agree with me. What I am saying is so true, and I'm so convinced that my side of the story is so true, that my opinion is true, Because I love you, I need you to see things this way, right? This comes across very often in conversation when people use the term, let's say I'm talking to Ron. Ron, I love you dearly. And that's why I'm telling you. You ever hear that? And then they go on to strongly disagree with you and something that you did and how you did it, etc. In other words, the love itself could lead to actually exacerbating the disagreement, and that's because the ingredient of the Akiva students were missing was okay. But before we get to kavod, this is another. They're pointing out a very good thing on the slides. I want to just call attention to that. You ever hear the term agree to disagree? Yes. That is often the opposite of love, right? It's been said that that the opposite of love is not hatred. What is the opposite of love? Anybody? Indifference. Being apathetic to the other person. I don't care. It really doesn't make a difference to me what you do, right? Often that's what happens in a relationship that we don't care that much about when we disagree with someone. We use the term agree to disagree. I agree to disagree with you. What does that mean? It means you're not worth enough for me to actually want you to be on the same page as me. But the more you respect, the more you value that other person's opinion, the more you value that other person as a person, the harder it becomes to say agree to disagree. I'm happy to tell my neighbor down the block, oh, you voted on the other side of the aisle as me, agree to disagree. Basically what you're saying is, kiss my you-know-what, right? You're saying, all right, no problem. Let's just not talk about it. You hold that, I'll hold this, and let's agree to disagree. But because I don't care enough about you, it's okay that you're holding such a mistaken opinion that I believe is completely wrong. When you actually care about someone, when you love somebody, not only does it not conquer all, but sometimes if it's an important issue enough, you actually want to change the other person's mind because you want them to actually have the right opinion, right? But all that is only if it's only based on love. What was the key ingredient that we said that Akiva students were missing? It's the last word, or at least last few words of text 2a, Shelo nohagu kavod zelazeh. They did not behave towards each other with respect. Respect is a whole different ballgame. Respect means I come to this conversation, yes, I love you, right? But I don't allow that love to become so overpowering that you now become swallowed up into my existence. We become just one homogeneous existence. Respect means there's distance. Think about people you respect. You respect someone who's like way above you in terms of how much they know, a teacher or a mentor that you have. You respect them very much, right? You respect the king, maybe you respect a rabbi, right? Somebody who's like very we respect our parents, right? Or people that are much older than us. There's a certain distance that we have. I'm 20 years old. You're 80 years old. I believe you have a ton more experience than me. Therefore, there's a distance between me and you, and therefore that I respect you. In a good relationship, in order to make sure that the love doesn't become part of the problem, it needs to be balanced by kavod, which here they're translated as respect or honor or reverence. So just to clarify, it's not a call to reduce our love. Of course, we have to love everyone on their level in our relationships. We should love our children and our parents and our spouses and our siblings, but at the same time, that should be balanced with the respect and honor or reverence to their opinion and to their existence. In other words, that we can be two separate existences that then come into a relationship. And when you have both of those, the space in which kavod and love, respect and love exist, that's where you can have a healthy relationship. Okay. In order to really clarify this point about kavod, which is just, again, so far all we're doing is dispelling myths, right? We have this video that I'm going to play for you, and I just want to clarify what the video is about, and that's going to really help us understand this important ingredient in a relationship, which is respect in addition to love, to balance the love with respect. The video is going to talk about the importance of why lighting Shabbat candles brings peace into the home, but it's going to be unpacking the two Hebrew words for morning and evening. All right? I think that's enough of an introduction for me to set this up for you. Please turn your attention to the video screens and to learn a little bit more about the separation that is necessary in a relationship, the distance.
Each Friday before sunset, Jewish homes glow with candles lit in honor of Shabbat. The Talmud states that these lights bring peace to the home. But what's the connection between light and peace? The Maharal of Prague explained this link through the etymology of two Hebrew words. Boker, that's Hebrew for morning. The root of boker means examine and discern. Erev, that's Hebrew for evening. The root of erev means mixture. These roots make sense. Morning light helps us examine distinctions and discern boundaries, like noticing where the landing ends and the steps begin. In contrast, the darkness of evening blurs distinctions, causing the blending of objects, like putting a fork in the wrong drawer. While blending things might seem harmonious, it can quickly lead to chaos. On the other hand, using light to distinguish between things might sound like disunity, but it creates harmony. It prevents one entity from invading another's space. That's genuine peace. Now let's apply this to relationships. A relationship in the light means recognizing and respecting the other person as a distinct personality with unique thoughts and preferences. We may not always agree, but we honor their feelings, consider their opinions, and respect their wants, understanding that God designs each personality for a unique mission in life. This in the light recognition fosters mutual harmony. A relationship in the dark is when we fail to recognize and respect that the other person is a distinct individual with unique ways of thinking. It's when we see personalities as accidents rather than God's design for a unique mission in this world. This leads to disregarding feelings, negating opinions, and ignoring wants. In this darkness, we invade each other's space, leading to even darker consequences. Now you know why Shabbat candles are conducive to peaceful relationships. Those physical lights remind us to switch on our conceptual lights in our relationships. When each side creates space for the other, they can happily share space. When they respect their differences, they can also focus on their similarities. When they allow for mutual autonomy, they can discover harmony. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, so far we have had two myths that we have busted about disagreeing in relationships. Number one, that they are actually a cause for crisis, that they're a problem. No, they're normal and they're natural. Number two, that love can overcome any relationships. No, turns out not. Don't be too heavy on the love. It actually might lead to problems. You need to balance love with respect. And this is going to lead us to the third myth about relationships, which is also going to finally give us our first tip, or at least our first how to disagree. You'll see that as we go through the lesson, we're going to be building deeper and deeper ways, or I should say, we're going to start at beginner and we'll go to advanced, of different ways to disagree healthily. And by the time we're done with our third myth busting for today, we will have our first how to disagree on a very beginner's level. Okay? And this is a very, very simple myth that I want to bust here. Myth number 3 that we're busting for today, which is that every single disagreement needs to be dealt with. Okay? It's a very common disagreement. You want to deal with the disagreement, because otherwise, if you leave it to fester, it'll grow into something larger. That may sometimes be true, but very, very often, a very basic way to deal with disagreement, and maybe this is what Jonathan meant at the beginning of today's lesson when he said, don't sweat the small stuff. Some disagreements should just be left alone. Focus on everything else and not on that issue. And when you focus on all the other things that bring you, right, focus on what brings us together, not on what divides us. This is especially true, by the way, for the outer circles of our relationships. In other words, if you have a political difference, I think all of us understand intuitively that if you have a political difference with your barber at the hair salon, it should not be spoken about. Talk about the traffic, talk about the weather, talk about how you've been trying to save up to buy a house. Don't talk about politics, because it's just going to lead to disagreement. Now, obviously, that becomes more difficult when it comes to closer circles of relationship. Maybe that's where you might want to utilize the more advanced tools for disagreement, which we're going to introduce later on in today's lesson. But at least at its very basic level, and even in the circle of intimacy, even with our spouses and with our children, we can often use this with certain types of disagreements. You realize this is a dicey issue, don't deal with that. And I think there's this beautiful, beautiful story of the Rebbe disagreeing with someone, which I think really serves as a template for this. Jonathan, if I can ask you to read for us, please. We're on page 102. It's text 3. And it comes to us directly from the person who had this story with the Rebbe. His name is Rabbi Shmuel Lu. He was actually very, very good friends with my wife's grandfather before my wife's grandfather passed away.
Okay. On the day after Simchat Torah in 1974, the rabbi asked me if recently I had heard from a certain person, a communal figure in England. I said that as a matter of fact I had. I added that I had heard that this person had very strongly criticized the rabbi. The rabbi told me the reason for this person's harsh statements was that somebody had misinformed him about what the rabbi had said about him in public talk. As a result, this person believed that the rabbi had attacked him personally, but said the rabbi, I do not speak about personalities, I speak about ideas. As the rabbi was saying this, I decided within a split second that as soon as I returned to England, I would make an appointment with this communal figure and straighten things out. As I was thinking it, at that very moment, the rabbi said, it's not a good idea for you to tell him that I told you about this. Now, unfortunately, I'm a little bit of a wise guy, so I immediately figured out a way around it. I thought, I won't do it, but I'll get somebody else to do it. I was desperate to clear things up so that this person shouldn't have a negative feeling about the rabbi. But again, as I was thinking this was within a split second, the rabbi said, and it's not a good idea for you to ask somebody else to go to speak with him. The point is that there are 613 commandments in the Torah. If this person will not work with us on this one mitzvah, let him work with us on the other 612. He then explained to me about how to become close with this person and how to befriend him. He described how positive this man and his family were and how they could be forces for good. And to me, this became a directive for life in general. Look for the unifying force. Always look for that which you have in common with other person and build on that.
And this, I think, is our first way to disagree. While it's undeniable that certain disagreements are going to need discussion and need to be resolved, because if you let them fester, they will grow into something larger, and we'll talk about those as we go through the lesson, many disagreements are just simple ego battles. And if we just make an internal decision to let go of it, we can choose to let go of it and say, okay, that's my opinion, this is the other person's opinion. It doesn't have to be dealt with. And that's kind of myth number 3, which maybe was very obvious to people. But I think it's very, very important to say, if we're going to be having a conversation about disagreements, the first thing that's very important to talk about, which is not all myths need to be dealt with. You can focus on other areas. Okay. So this leads us to page 103, and this is going to grow, by the way. On page 103, we have figure 3.2, right? And basically what we've been trying to do is, we've been trying to build a list of how to disagree. The lessons that we're taking from today's lesson, how to disagree, right? And so far what we've had is, number 1, don't panic. It's healthy and normal, right? It's an expected reality of any relationship. Number 2, love is important, but it's not alone sufficient. Make sure you're not expecting a homogeny, and you actually are leaving space for the other person to be a person, in their relationship, in the relationship, to be who they are in the relationship. And finally, maybe sometimes it's best to just leave it alone and to just, like we said at the beginning of the lesson, agree to disagree, even though you love them so much. Maybe this one has to be left alone. Okay. We are now going to move forward. We're going to get into a deeper, and the better way to put it is more advanced. Till now, we've been beginner's level. Beginner's level. If somebody really has a major issue with disagreeing with other people, the first thing they can learn is it's a healthy and normal part of life. Don't sweat every single one of them. Leave it alone. Don't make such a big deal out of it. Move past it. Focus on the other 612 mitzvahs that you do have in common with this person. Don't make a massive deal out of the one thing you disagree with, which is often what people do. Okay. In order to take this up to an advanced level, I'd like to bring you back to the first parsha of the Torah. We read this about 5 weeks ago. And this is when the Torah tells us the story of creation. All right? As you go through the story of creation, and many of you are probably familiar with this because you've probably read it in the Torah, you will notice something interesting. When it comes to the first day of creation, Hashem says, sorry, there we go. It says that Hashem created the dark and the light, right? And he separated between the dark and the light. Vayar Elokim Kitov, and Hashem saw that it was good, and he said it was good. Beautiful. Forget the exact word. So basically, God saw that it was good, and it was good. And that was the first day. It was an evening, and it was a morning, and that was the first day. On the second day, those words are glaringly missing, especially as you keep going, and you see that every other day has it, right? The second day, when Hashem separates the upper waters from the lower waters, the clouds from the seas, right? It does not say that it was good. Okay, let's keep going. On day number 3, when Hashem when Hashem brings forth the ground, right? Besides for just separating the waters, upper and lower waters, he then makes ground be visible from throughout the world. There's the oceans, and he gathers the waters to make oceans, and he allows the ground to come forth, Adama. All of a sudden we find something very interesting. Hashem says it was good twice. By the way, this leads to a very, very common Jewish practice, which is try to do as many major life milestones on a Tuesday. Has anybody ever heard this before? If you're going to move into a new home, move in on a Tuesday. If you're going to get married, and you can get married on any day, get married on a Tuesday. Like, in other words, if there's other considerations, obviously you do it on a different day. Like if the hall is only available on a Wednesday, you do it on a Wednesday. But as often as possible, do it on a Tuesday. Why? Because it's Yom Shehuchpa Bo Kitov. It is the day that Hashem said twice the words Kitov. Hashem saw that it was good. Okay. What's going on here? Why on the first day does it say good? On the second day it doesn't say good. The second day seems to be not good. And then on the third day it says good twice. So the Medrash begins the explanation on page 105. Helene, can you read for us? I don't know if you can unmute yourself. I know you're on the phone. I know you have a book. Helene, Rose? Okay, it looks like it's more difficult to do when you're on the phone than when you're on the computer with the Zoom. And I know her internet is not working, so... All right, so Elise, we're back to you. Page 105, text 4, not good.
Why doesn't the Torah report it was good on the second day? Rabbi Hanina taught division was created on that day as is stated. Let there be a separation between water and water. Rabbi Tavyame taught if God declined to declare an act of division necessary for the planet's betterment as good, how much more so regarding division among people that inflicts disturbance on the world?
Okay, so the Medrash is telling us that because on the second day division, disagreement, right, separation was created. That's when the upper waters and the lower waters were separated from each other. That this is the source of all conflict that exists in the world. I know that some of you are thinking, hold on the first day there was division between light and dark. But the truth is that this conflict, this didn't create conflict in the world. Even though it was division, it didn't create conflict in the world for a few reasons. Number one, the light transcended the world, such that anything that occurred to it had no bearing on the nature of the world. In other words, just because light was being separated, light is much higher in the world. That didn't embed itself within the fabric of creation. And also, light and darkness, although we say they were separated on the first day, they weren't really. Light and dark were inherently separated even before that. So, according to Kabbalah, the second day is the day that division, conflict was embedded within this world. Okay. Now, so you think to yourself, hold on a second. So on the second day, conflict was created. So first of all, you could think to yourself, why? Why would Hashem create conflict, right? Why would he create division? Number two, you think to yourself, okay, so it wasn't good, right? But what happens on the third day? On the third day, it says it was good twice, right? Why does it say it was good twice on the third day? So the Zohar gives us the further explanation by offering an even deeper understanding of this day two level of conflict. What is that? Heaven and earth, upper waters and lower waters, are not the only conflicts that there are in creation. In fact, they are just symptoms of a larger conflict that there is within creation. And what is that? That is the division between spiritual and physical. So in the Zohar's explanation, the unity of heaven and earth on the first day meant that the physical and spiritual were united in the sense that all reality was imbued with the consciousness of the divine. So one of the main things that God needed to do in order to create the world was to create division between physicality and spirituality, between the material and the spiritual. And that happened on the second day. They became two distinct entities, right? So just because something physical exists doesn't mean it is spiritually uplifted and a holy and a beautiful, wonderful thing. It could be a completely separate entity. Now, in other words, there was a seemingly real and not really reconcilable conflict between two completely opposing realms. Okay? Now, when you understand this as being the fundamental conflict or division that was created on the second day, now we can begin to understand why on the third day it says it was good twice. What happened on the third day? On the third day, Adama was created. Adama is the Hebrew word for the ground, right? The ground began to surface. Why is that so significant? Because Adama in Hebrew is the same letters as the word Adam, which means man, right? They're etymologically related. Now, it's not just that they're etymologically related because the letters are the same, or maybe the spiritual energy is the same, but actually the entire purpose of the ground being created was so that on the sixth day, man can be formed from the dust of the earth, and then he can begin to work with the world. What is the human being's role in this world? So we know this already from the sixth day, during Yom HaShishi, which is the words of Kiddush. When we say lasod letaken, it says that on the sixth day Hashem created a human being lesaken in order to fix the world. I'm not going to get into the whole concept of tikkun olam or fixing the world. It's a much deeper Kabbalistic concept than lends itself right now to the time that we have right now. But what I do want to say is that if you look at this three-step process, you end up with a very, very clear understanding of what is good and what is not good, and then how you can fix that not good. What happens? On day one, we have one big, massive, homogeneous creation. Physical and spiritual are just one big blob. On day two, Hashem creates division. We haven't gotten into why yet. But for some reason, Hashem wanted to create two separate entities that would kind of seem not reconcilable. And then on day three, he created the potential for those two things to come and join together and actually be one. And that's what a human being does, right? On day one, breakfast and whatever, food and learning Torah was all one thing. It was all part of one existence. On day number two, eating breakfast and studying Torah, two completely separate activities. On day number three, Hashem embedded within the world the ability to eat breakfast in a holy way. Use that energy to then go serve God and study Torah and do mitzvot, etc., and do wonderful things. In other words, the ability to marry the two, to marry the material with the spiritual. It isn't random, by the way, that these events, division and reconciliation, occur on the second and third days of creation, because actually the number two itself represents division. Not just because number one is one and two is already two separate entities. 2 versus 3, the numbers, just the numbers. 2 versus 3 represents division and then reconciliation. This comes to us from the Maharal. It's text 5. But before we read it, let me first demonstrate it for you on the screen. Okay, take a look. If you have lines, all right, and you have one line, one line is one line. But let's say you have 2 lines, right, and you try to make those 2 lines be reconciled, there is actually physically no way to do so. You cannot take 2 lines, geometrically speaking. You cannot take 2 lines, 2 straight lines, and ever connect them entirely. There's a few options here on the screen. You can see them, right? You have 2 of them next to each other. Obviously, they're not connected. You can have them like this, like this. You can never actually form a complete reconciliation. But with 3 lines, it's the first time that you can actually create a full and not homogeneous. Homogeneous was day 1, right? You can create a reconciliation where all 3 of these lines are connected with each other. This is a very Kabbalistic concept, and it comes to us from a Kabbalist, text 5. If you didn't follow it with me, pay attention to the way the Maharal of Prague says it. Ron, if you can read for us, please. We're on page 106, text 5, between 2 and 3.
The number 2 symbolizes a plurality that cannot unite. The number 3, by contrast, symbolizes unity. We observe this when depicting it. Two adjacent lines like this cannot unite and do not appear as one entity. However, with 3 lines like this, the lines can unite.
All right. And so it turns out that this was the process of creation. Hashem started creation where everything was just God, everything was just the physical and spiritual was all part of God. Then he divided into two separate creations, the physical and the spiritual, and then on the third day he brought them all together. Okay, the big question that remains is, why? Why would God do so? Is there a benefit? In other words, if you started off on day one with unity, and then on day three, what you're looking for is reconciliation, that's why you call it good twice, right? So then why would you create a step which is conflict and then embed conflict within the world? To make this a very personal question and a very personal conversation, let me ask the question this way. Why would Hashem make it that me and you have very different types of personalities? He could have made us all easily agreeable. Why would he put disagreement within the world? Right? So to explain this, I think the best way is through an analogy. Okay? Imagine you are the CEO and the founder of a beautiful business. You start off on day one, it's just you. Can't afford anyone else. You don't need anyone else. You're just starting off. All right. You start off and you're building your business and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. During this period, you have what I would call unchallenged oneness. It's just you. Not because you have the best opinion in the world, because there's nobody to challenge you. Whatever you say in the business, how you're going to operate the business, that's what goes. Right? Okay. Now, then the business starts to grow. So you talk with some friends and they advise that you should bring some partners into the business. So you bring some other folks into the business. Right? Now you have what we would call diversity. What does diversity mean? It means that until now, if you decided there should only be blue pens in the conference room, there's only blue pens in the conference room. But now if one person wants blue and another person wants green, another person wants yellow, right? So now you have yellow, red pens, right? Then all of a sudden you have diversity of opinion, right? So you think to yourself, darn, I should never have done this. The business was operating so beautifully before this, right? Why do we do this? We do this because when done properly, you can reach a stage after bringing on new people into the business where now you have harmonized oneness. So in other words, you went from the unchallenged oneness to division, to diversity, and that brings you to a greater stage of harmonized oneness, right? What does it say about you if you are an unchallenged thinker? So you're just the one person that runs the whole business. There's no employees, no partners, no nothing. It doesn't really say much about you. It just says you're successful at business. That's it, right? But it doesn't say anything about your leadership skills or your relationship skills. What about if you bring on three other people and you go through this period like, oh, you have a different opinion. You have a different. And then what happens if you can build now an empire of employees that each one of them has their diverse opinion, yet they all still respect your opinion, right? And they come back to you because they know that their opinion will be valued and you'll take their opinion into account and you will lead in a powerful and beautiful way, bringing all of those opinions together. Then you will reach a higher stage, which is higher than unchallenged oneness, which is harmonized oneness. It's much more valuable for the company, right? This, my friends, is what Hashem wanted when he created the world. Hashem didn't, if he wants to continue to exist in unity, he could have never created the world. The purpose of creating the world was because Hashem wanted harmonized oneness. In other words, are there positive outcomes from a disagreement? We have now learned that there are massive benefits to disagreement. And this is where this becomes now the advanced way of dealing with disagreement. Why? Because, hold on a second. What we've learned is, you can see this on page 107 in your figure, what we've learned is that before you have disagreement, you do not have the option for this higher level of harmonized oneness. And only through disagreement do you get through to that. Okay? So if you follow with me on the bottom of page 107, where we're going to go through the lessons from creation, the first lesson that we get from creation is that there are positive outcomes from a disagreement in this way. Number one, conflict is woven into the fabric of creation. All right? And that means, there's no slide for this one. We're following along in the figure on page 107 as we go through the lessons from the creation narrative, right? Lesson number one is, we mentioned this earlier in the first part of the lesson. Lesson number one for creation is conflict, diversity, disagreement. That's embedded within the fabric of creation, not something to be afraid of. Okay. Another thing we've learned is conflict is a negative phenomenon. It's not a good thing. It's not tov. Hashem does not say about day number two that it is a good day. But what we have learned is that, and this is point number 3, that if you navigate it properly, then conflict can give rise to a higher level of reconciliation. And that is the third day where Hashem says twice, it is good. Finally, what we've learned is that higher level of reconciliation is a greater value than uniformity is, as we explained above. Okay. So now, I think we would all do well to ask ourselves the following question. Are there positive outcomes that can be produced by a disagreement? And if so, what are they? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. What do you think, Jonathan? Once we move past the stage of I'll just choose to focus on all the other elements of our relationship and not deal with disagreement. I'm going to deal with it. Are there positive things that can come out of a disagreement?
Well, of course, because through the process, you may learn aspects of thought that another person has that you did not consider, and stepping away from the disagreement and thinking about it, you may actually benefit, in the long run by taking those aspects into conversation.
Very, very good.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to take this and run with it. I'm sorry, I was going to take a few opinions from everybody, but I loved so much what you're going to say, and it segues perfectly into the next point that we're going to make here, that we're going to use this as our segue. Jonathan is bringing up a very, very valuable point, which is if we try and apply this 3-step process of uniformity, division or conflict, and then reconciliation to our day-to-day lives, we will walk away with a very, very powerful understanding that disagreement is not just not a negative thing. It's not just a natural, normal thing. It's not just something we can overcome, but it can actually be a stepping stone towards a much, much deeper, harmonious relationship. Why? Because if you go, and it's only if you go into it properly. It's only if you go into it healthily, not if you go in to win. Right? That's what the animal soul wants to do. The animal soul always wants to win, right? That's what he wants. But if you go into it with the godly soul, in other words, you're trying to actually grow from it, then disagreement can be the source of growth. And it's a high level, it's an advanced level, but let's take a look at a template for this, which is a story about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Okay, so before getting into it, let me just give you some background as to who these people were, and then Phil, if I can ask you, you'll read for us text 6, Yearning for Challenge. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish was also known as Reish Lakish, and you'll see him in the text known as that. They were two of the most famous sages of the Talmud. As children, they grew up together in a city that was known as Tzipori. It's in the northern Israel. It's in the north of Israel, and it's called Tzipori. At the time, in Talmudic times, this was a very, very big haven for Talmudic scholarship. But their lives took very, very different turns. Rabbi Yochanan studied at the academy of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, one of the most famous. He was the author of the Mishnah, the compiler of the Mishnah, and the leader of the Jewish people at the time. And as a result, he became a very big Talmudic scholar. Reish Lakish became an outlaw, and he led a band of gangsters. Okay. And they were childhood friends, and then they went their two separate ways. Now, one day, the two childhood acquaintances, this comes to us in the Talmud, in Bava Metzia, the Talmud tells us the story. The two childhood acquaintances bump into each other. Where do they meet? They meet at the Jordan River. All right? Without getting into all the details of the story, Rabbi Yochanan saw Reish Lakish showing a tremendous display of physical prowess. He was very, very strong. And Rabbi Yochanan exhorted him to use his strength in the study of Torah rather than as a highway robbery. Reish Lakish took these words to heart. As a result of this story, they actually became brothers-in-law. Reish Lakish married Rabbi Yochanan's sister. And the Talmud records that Reish Lakish began to study so diligently that he used to say that the moon was created in order to learn Torah by its light at night. He grew in his Torah study to such a degree that Rabbi Yochanan stopped treating him as a student, and he became an equal. And he became his constant study partner. Okay? And this is where I want to get to. Despite the fact that he was his constant study partner, they rarely saw eye to eye. They had very, very different personalities and very, very different ways of approaching Torah study, although they're both great Talmudic scholars, and they would argue all the time. The Talmud records hundreds of halachic arguments between the two of them. With this background, I think now we're ready to dive into the text. So Phil, if you can unmute yourself. And on page 109, we're going to read this amazing perspective of what happens when Reish Lakish passes away. Text 6.
Text 6. When Reish Lakish passed away, Rabbi Yochanan grieved terribly. The sages told each other who should visit him to provide comfort. Let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, for he is a brilliant scholar. Rabbi Elazar ben Padat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan. To each idea that Rabbi Yochanan taught, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat responded, I know of an earlier teaching that supports your opinion. Rabbi Yochanan exclaimed, are you supposed to be like Reish Lakish? In my discussions with Reish Lakish, whenever I would share a viewpoint, he would raise 24 objections and I would be forced to deliver 24 responses. As a result of our intense give and take, the entire subject was crystallized. You, however, constantly tell me there is an earlier teaching that supports your opinion. Do I not already know that my ideas are sound? Rabbi Yochanan went about in grief. He tore his clothes, wept, and called out, where are you, Reish Lakish? Where are you, Reish Lakish?
In pop psychology, we would say that Rabbi Yochanan was not looking for an echo chamber, right? In other words, what they were trying to do is they were trying to replace Reish Lakish, and they made the mistake of thinking, because everybody likes when somebody agrees with them, right? So they're like, oh, let's bring him somebody who's so smart that he'll bring all sorts of proof to what he's saying and help him agree. He's like, dude, I knew my opinion was sound. I didn't need you to come here and reaffirm my opinion. You came here, what I needed from you, what I valued in my relationship with Reish Lakish was that he would disagree with me. And as a result of the give and the take and the back and the forth and the tennis match where we look at the animation on the screen, I love it, right? What would happen is we would each become smarter. We would each become more valuable, more deeper in our perspective on this particular Torah concept. We would appreciate it more, and we would. I don't want to be worshipped. I want to be challenged. That's what I want. And this explains the Rebbe is why Hashem hardwired into human beings into our very nature, that we constantly disagree with each other. Every single one of us comes in it with our own unique life experience, with our own with our own opinions and with our own perspectives, and then we end up disagreeing with each other. Take a look at text 7, where the Rebbe explains this. Ron, if you can read for us, please. Strength in Perspectives, page 111.
The Almighty deliberately created humans with diverse perspectives, although that allows the possibility that due to differing opinions, humans could wind up not treating each other with respect. Obviously, God's intention in creating people this way was not to enable conflict, but its exact opposite, to facilitate a superior unity that emerges on the heels of division, the advantage of the number 3. The presence of multiple opinions yields multiple fresh points and ideas. Each individual contributes from their unique intellect, eventually leading to a better conclusion and decision. When different individuals with dissimilar perspectives discuss a matter jointly without any individual suppressing or forfeiting their viewpoint, for that would contradict the nature imbued in us by God, the matter can be viewed from several angles, leading to a truer conclusion than any single viewpoint. Needless to say, if parties set this as their goal, they will conduct their discussion peacefully and with mutual respect.
And this explains the Azhar Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and other famous Talmudic, sparring partners. There's lots of them, right? That they had a relationship not only because of their differences. Not only despite their differences, but because of their differences. In other words, they appreciated that the other person disagreeing with them wasn't a challenge to them. Actually, it was the biggest compliment and the biggest gift that they can give them. There is a quote in the Talmud, which J.L.I. didn't include, that I sent out in one of my emails while I was marketing this course, that I think is so powerful to share right now. You see, Jews have never agreed with each other throughout history, but there was always a unique way to disagree. The Talmud records Rabbi Chia bar Abba is saying as follows. I'm reading to you from the email that I sent out. Even a father and his son, or a rabbi and his student who are engaged in Torah study, should become enemies with each other due to the intensity of their studies. Whoa! You're like, hold on a second, right? There's another expression that's used, which is kinat sofrim tar b'chachma, which means jealousy, literally jealousy. The jealousy of Talmudic scholars of each other will add in wisdom. If you treat it as a competition, you go into the ring with your boxing gloves on, and if you go into any yeshiva around the world, you'll see this attitude. They're disagreeing with each other. You look at them, they're screaming at each other. You're like, oh my God, these two people almost hate each other, right? But how does the Talmud finish off? The Talmud says, but they do not leave there until they love each other. In other words, you enter the ring. You're gonna butt heads with each other. You're gonna do it, but only if it's appreciated that what you're trying to get to is to help each other reach an even deeper understanding because you truly love each other. So the disagreeing is done. And that's why. So ad hominem attacks should completely be off the table here. This is not a disagreement with the person. This is a disagreement with their opinion, right? If you go back to that story of when Rabbi Shmuel Lu was saying how the Rebbe was telling him to disagree with the other person, right? The Rebbe told him, he says, I do not speak about personalities, I speak about ideas. The Rebbe never disagreed with a person. The Rebbe always disagreed with principles, with someone else's ideas, right? You could disagree with someone else's ideas without disagreeing with the person themselves. And my friends, not to harp on about the same point over and over again in every single lesson, but we started at the beginning of the course saying that it's all going to boil down to which part of you are you tapping into. Remember that? It depends who. Here we go. The view on disagreements, which is, are you coming into this disagreement in order to mutually grow? Or is this a battle of egos because I want to be right? I'm addicted to being right. And that's what I want to get out of this conversation. This is 100% the difference between coming into an argument, coming into a disagreement with your animal soul, or coming in with your godly soul. Coming in just wanting more ego, more me, more selfishness, then of course the disagreement is not going to be healthy. Why? Because you're coming in with the wrong attitude. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the way they would disagree vehemently over and over and over again, as did lots of other sages in the Talmud. But it was always godly soul driven. It was always, how can we both mutually grow out of this? And I think this brings us to page 112, excuse me, where there is an exercise on the table. In light of text 6 and 7, where we just uncovered what is the proper way to disagree, is to come into it with your godly soul. To come into it not to build myself up, but actually so that we both mutually can grow out of it. So now consider, I want you to identify attitudes that you consider constructive to navigating disagreements effectively, as well as contrasting attitudes that invite strife. So on page 112, I'll give you about 60 seconds. You can write that down. Some things that obviously are animal soul driven and some things that are obviously godly soul driven, which when it comes to a disagreement are going to lead to either looking for mutual growth or just looking for an ego battle. Okay. Okay. All of what we've said until now is all fine and dandy. We've introduced a beginner's level of disagreeing, which is just avoid the issues of conflict. Okay, maybe sometimes that's helpful, at least for a beginner's level. Then if you want to take it up a notch, you can begin to get a little bit more advanced, which is you can engage in the disagreement, but you only engage in it in order to grow. Not as an ego battle, but in order to grow. And the deepest level of all is to make sure that it's driven only by your godly soul. Come into the disagreement completely selfless with your opinion and the other person's opinion. There has to be kavod. There has to be an appreciation of each person's perspective, but come into it only selflessly and not with your animal soul. But this is all fine and dandy to say, but then, as always, the question becomes, how do I shift my attitude in the middle of a disagreement, or as the disagreement is beginning? How do I make sure that I come into it with the right attitude? And for this, my friends, there are some practical tips that we are going to talk about today. First of all, I think we need to recall everything we said in the previous lesson. That's probably the most important thing. Listening skills. I think this is why Phil, immediately when we started talking about disagreeing, he said he thinks the whole key to disagreeing was last week's lesson. Why? Because it is. Listening properly is the first step towards disagreeing properly. You know, the Talmud tells us that when it came to Hillel and Shammai, hold on a second. I think it's in the appendix. Give me a second. Let me see. Yeah, if you turn to page 136, we can do this appendix C, which the sage's attitude it's called. The first thing, I think probably the first and most important thing that indicates a healthy argument, a healthy disagreement, is when the person is open to the other person changing their mind, right? And that means you have to start off by listening to the other person, all right? Not surprisingly, the sages of the Talmud always did this. They were always open and listening to the other person's argument. And this is expressed in text 15, which is this Mishnah, which opens with a ruling by Hillel on a particular question related to a mikveh. The details really aren't that important. And then it says that Shammai disagreed. Okay? So Hillel and Shammai were two sages that often disagreed with each other. It says Hillel's opinion, and then it says that Shammai disagreed. In other words, it said Hillel's opinion first, and then it says Shammai's opinion later. Now, then the Mishnah goes on to report the following. Elise, can you read for us, please? Text 15, page 136. Keep your finger on the regular place where we are now, and just let's read the appendix.
The matter remained in dispute until two weavers arrived from Jerusalem's Dung Gate and shared personal testimony that Shemaiah and Avtalon Kadkat taught, contrary to the views of both Hillel and Shammai. Thereupon, all of the sages, including Hillel and Shammai, ratified their words. But why are the opinions of Hillel and Shammai recorded in this instance, if their views are ultimately negated? To teach future generations that we should not stubbornly cling to our opinions, for despite their remarkable stature, Hillel and Shammai were not stubborn in their opinions.
How amazing is that? The Mishnah tells us two opinions, and then it goes on to say that they came or whatever, and somebody taught us the right opinion, and it wasn't like Hillel, and it wasn't like Shammai. So right away you ask yourself, hold on a second, why are you giving us the opinion of Hillel and Shammai if it wasn't like any of them? Right? Normally there's a disagreement, two different opinions, and it turns out one of them is right. Yeah, I understand why you're giving me both opinions, but here none of them were right. So he says the reason is to teach us the very valuable lesson of not being right. You have to be able to go into an argument. The first and most important tip that we're talking about is listening skills. All of the listening skills we spoke about last week are extremely important when it comes to disagreeing. Why? Because if you're listening only in order to be able to refute the other person and be right in the argument, which, like we said, was issue number one in listening, right? Is you have to quiet the voice inside your head, because then you're not really listening. Right? Then you're never going to be able to disagree healthily. The first thing that's needed is to listen like a mensch. Listen so open-minded and so just absorbing that you're listening. You know what? It might be the other person's opinion actually is right. And very often that's the fundamental roadblock to us even disagreeing with somebody healthily, is that we're not even open to being proven wrong. Okay. But there are also speaking skills. So listening skills I could go on and on about, but we really did the whole lesson. See last week's lesson. Right? But there are also speaking skills. And that is a proper way to speak, which we didn't talk about last week, right? And that comes to us beginning from text 8. Phil, if you can read for us, please, from Ecclesiastes, page 114, Wisdom's Whisper.
So, softly spoken words of the wise are heard louder than the roars of foolish rulers.
I think that's such an amazing statement. Let me tell you what I love most about this statement. It says softly spoken words, right, of the wise. It doesn't say are good are better than the roars of foolish rulers. What it says is they're heard. Speak smarter, not louder, right? That's a cardinal rule that we can all use all the time. If you have something smart to say it quietly. You never need to raise your voice, and raising your voice doesn't just mean physically, like in or I don't know what the word is, in volume. It can also mean in tone, right? Keep your words soft. We're going to talk a lot about that in a moment, not just about the volume, but also word selection. But for now, let's go to text 9, where we talk about the fact that sometimes it's literally just trigger words, if you will. Jonathan, if you can read for us, please, text 9 on page 114.
Talking tentatively simply means that we tell our story as a storyteller rather than disguising it as a hard fact. Perhaps you were unaware. Suggests that you are not absolutely certain, in my opinion. Says you're sharing an opinion and no more. When sharing a story, strike a blend between confidence and humility. Share in a way that expresses appropriate confidence in your conclusions while demonstrating that if called for, you want your conclusions challenged. To do so, change the fact is to in my opinion. Swap everyone knows that, for I've talked to 3 of 4 suppliers who think that. Soften it's clear to me to I'm beginning to wonder if. Why soften the message? Because we're trying to add meaning to the pool, not force it down people's throats. If we're too forceful, the information won't make it into the pool. One of the ironies of dialogue is that when we're talking with those holding opposing opinions, the more convinced and forceful you act, the more resistant others become. Speaking in absolute and overstated terms does not increase your influence, it decreases it. The converse is also true. The more tentatively you speak, the more open people become to your opinions.
Such an important text. I think everyone can read this 2 or 3 times and look at the figure on page 116 2 or 3 times. What are we saying? We're saying like this. It's essentially the same point that was made in the Mishnah with Hillel and Shammai. But it's not just in listening. You're listening with an open mind. You're speaking with an open mind. The right words can often be all that is necessary in order to communicate to the other person that I have come to this conversation in a respectful manner and in a way that I'm disagreeing with my godly soul. Disagreeing is a good thing. It's fine. But I'm coming here not to win, but to understand, to clarify, to grow together. And that's communicated in the way you listen. It's also communicated in the words that you use, right? When we say things like, in my opinion, instead of the fact is. What are you saying? You're saying, listen, this is where I am right now. Let's see how this conversation develops, right? When you use forceful words like absolutely it has to be done that way, right? Or it must be done that way. You always do this, right? Instead of using softer and more open terms, not saying things like this is what we have to do or everyone knows that. These are words that don't really open themselves up to a conversation where you're actually valuing the other opinion, but rather you're coming to it with an animal soul perspective. My perspective goes, and that's it. And this is why you find this throughout Talmudic and even post-Talmudic language, all the way up until the 20th century. If you open up any Torah book of a Torah scholar of any level, you will find certain words in opening up their opinions. Let's read text 10. Ron, if you can read for us, please.
It is common for halakhic authorities to state their opinions with the term of moderation. Efshar, meaning perhaps this is so. Nevertheless, subsequent halakhic authorities will proceed to cite such an opinion as the unequivocal view of the earliest sage, omitting the modification, and and they will base their rulings on the stated opinion. This is done because Efshar does not necessarily imply doubt. Rather, it is an unpretentious way to express oneself.
Raise your hand if you've ever seen a page of Talmud before. Okay, if you haven't, or if you'd like to explore more, that's what our next course is about. It's called Decoding the Talmud. We're really going to take a deep dive into Talmud, to understand, not to study Talmud as well. We'll do a lot of studying of Talmud, but we're going to explore what Talmud is all about, how Talmud came about, and what the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud. Anyways, I'll leave a plug for the next course some other time. But if you take a look at the page of Talmud is made up of the Talmud in the center, and on the outer sides is Tosfot, and on the inner sides is Rashi. Okay, Tosfot is one of the most basic commentary on the Talmud. Whenever Tosfot asks a question and gives an answer, okay, here's how he phrases his questions and his answers. It like they teach this to you in yeshivas, in religious schools. They teach this to you in like 4th or 5th grade. The first time you open up a Tosfot and they introduce you to it for the first time, you learn certain key words. That this word means the question is starting, this word means the answer is starting. You do the same thing for Talmud two grades earlier, like in 3rd grade. But as you start to explore Tosfot, they teach you. Whenever the words Ve'im Tomar come around, that means Tosfot is asking a question. All right? What are the words for when Tosfot opens up an answer? V'yesh lomar. V'yesh lomar means it's possible to say. Trust me, he's not saying it's possible to say. Tosfot is giving you a hardcore answer to the big question that he just asked. Here's the way to understand it. You didn't understand it, and now you're going to understand it. Here's my opinion. V'yesh lomar, it's possible to say. Efsher is the one that the Stei Chamed is telling us about. Efsher, possibly you can answer like this. Lichura, apparently this could be an answer. They're giving you real firm opinions. If you look in follow-up commentary that are quoting them, they're quoting them as fact. They're not quoting them they're quoting them as strong opinions, but it's always introduced softly. I'm not saying this applies across the board. There are definitely times when an opinion is given more forcefully, and there's even times when very colorful language is used in the Talmud and this explanation is given for that. But as a general rule, in Torah language, when you disagree with somebody, it's like, maybe, perhaps, I'd like to suggest, like this, in a very soft way. These are words, literal words. These are tips that we can use in our conversations to make, obviously, volume and tone is a big part of it, but even the words that we use can be more gentle. Okay. And this leads us to page 118, guidelines for constructive dialogue in challenging conversations, right? Just tips. And we're not going to go through this now, but these are just, they're all reflective of everything we've been learning now. Coming in with a godly soul attitude and entering calmly, not and if you're too heated, now's not the time. You know the way I like to put all these things? I like to put all these things like this. What you're trying to do is you're trying to enter an argument, a disagreement, with a godly soul attitude. Here's the problem. Certain things trigger the animal soul. When you say, you're wrong, you trigger the animal soul in the other person. So if you want to be able to get the other person to enter the conversation with their godly soul, then you need to come up with your godly soul. We need to stop using words that are so selfish and so focused on us and me and who it is. That's why I think across the board, most people agree that ad hominem attacks are never, right? That means when you attack the person's character instead of attacking the content of what they're saying. Why is that so destructive to a conversation? Because it triggers the other person's animal soul, and it means your animal soul was already triggered. So now you have two animal souls against each other. Of course, you're never going to be able to do anything. Everybody's selfish. Everybody just wants to win, and everybody just wants to come out of it with as much credit as they can, right? So of course this isn't going to go anywhere. But if we're trying to go in with two godly souls, then things like entering calmly, lowering our tones of voice, using certain words, listening to the other person, biting back our egos as much as possible, right? This is going to help us to be able to have a positive conversation. And I want to conclude with one last point, which is very often we say, we all know this is wrong, but we still all always say it. You say to yourself, it's not me, it's the other person. I'm only one person involved in this argument. I'm coming in with my godly soul, but what should I do? The other person's coming with their animal soul. It's almost always not true. Almost always you also have your animal soul involved. But let's give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that sometimes you're in an argument and you're actually coming, you're the big tzaddik in the room, and the other person isn't. Is there anything you can do to change the other person's attitude? It turns out there is. Phil, can you read for us, please? Text 11, which comes to us from Proverbs, from the wisest of all men, King Solomon. Mirrored emotions.
As water mirrors a face, so does one human heart reflect another.
Arguments escalate when I start at this tone of voice, and the other person disagrees and says, nah, I think you're wrong. And the other person says, how could I be wrong? You're wrong. And they're bouncing off each other. It's getting louder and louder and louder and louder and louder. And I don't just mean in volume, I mean in tone, and I mean in the words that we use, and the insults that we throw, etc. Why is it that if you watch an argument from beginning to end, a disagreement between two people that gets very, very heated by the end of it, you'll see that by the end of it, they're using the F word and this word and the four-letter word, all sorts of colorful words. At the beginning, they weren't. What happened? When there's two animal souls butting heads against each other, that's what happens. It's more me and more you and more me and more you and more me and more you and more me and more you. What can I do? You say to yourself, hold on, but even if I come into it just with my godly soul, the other person is doing what they're doing. It turns out that that's not how it works. Human beings very, very often mirror each other. Kamayim apanim apanim, just as water reflects a face, right? You look into a barrel of water or into a whatever, right? And you'll see the reflection of your face. Similarly, kain lev ha'adam ala adam, so too is the heart of a person to another person. When we speak softly, when we speak with respect, when we speak with kavod, when we come open to the other person's opinion, when we come to this disagreement, hoping to have a healthy disagreement which will lead to mutual growth, then it automatically reflects on the other person, even if they aren't trying to do so. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 3, the art of disagreeing.
Hold on. I think I forgot to do video. Yeah. Trying to figure out what, there we go. Let's start again.
Lesson 3, the art of disagreeing. 1. Perspective diversity is hardwired into human nature. When it surfaces in a relationship, it indicates that the parties are in touch with themselves and comfortable enough to express it. It does not imply that the relationship is in crisis. 2. Love alone is not the solution to navigating relationship disagreements. Love may actually backfire, spurring us to seek to convince others in vain to abandon their apparent imprudence, even when they are determined to see things differently. 3. A relationship requires both love and respect. This respect entails honoring the existence of a differing view as a valid product of each person's unique God-given personality. 4. Many disagreements are best left untouched. Life unfolds on a vast stage, offering ample opportunities for connection beyond the subject of disagreement. 5. Disagreements can provide opportunities to discover fresh perspectives and gain better understandings, leading to a situation superior to the pre-disagreement state. That is precisely why God created humankind with its radically diverse perspectives. Accordingly, disagreements can be exercises in friendship rather than instances of discord. 6. Our views on various matters are not concepts to be worshipped, but merely our best current understanding of the truth. This leaves us open to gain fresh understandings and modify our views. When both parties are committed to this approach, they will emerge with a mutually agreed upon enhanced understanding. 7. Disagreements are often seen as a battle between egos, where each party aims to dominate. This adversarial view is nothing but an instinct of the animal soul. The divine soul serves as the driving force behind the mindset that appreciates disagreement as a pathway to a doubled portion of goodness. 8. We express the attitude of respect by employing proper listening skills and using a gentle tone and non-domineering words. This raises the chances that our words will leave an impression on the listener.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 3 of nurturing relationships. This has been the art of disagreeing, and I hope to see you all next week for lesson 4, which will be the art of positivity, how to inject positivity into our relationships and not get stuck in the negative. Thank you all for joining us. See you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.